Our country has one of the most diverse populations in the world. For centuries, it's been a meeting place for people of different cultures and languages, all of which have contributed to a fascinating variety today. But we have a far more ancient human story preserved in the DNA of some South Africans. To find out more, I've come to see Himla Sujol at Pinnacle Point near Mossel Bay. It's an appropriate place because caves at Pinnacle Point contain archaeological deposits from people who lived here more than 160,000 years ago.
We're getting increasingly used to the idea that Africa is the sort of cradle of humankind. In fact, we've got a cradle of humankind in Gauteng. What do the genetics tell us?
Genetic data, when you explore it in all living people today, shows quite convincingly that the modern gene pool originated in Africa. Where in Africa? Well, Southern Africa is a good candidate because people indigenous to this area, like the San and the Khoi, harbor the oldest genetic signatures found in humans today. And isn't it wonderful that right here on our doorstep are the answers to this very epic question of where did we originate?
What does the genetic evidence tell us about Africa?
If we imagine a tree, on a tree we have many, many leaves, and there's some leaves that are placed on peripheral branches and other leaves that are placed on much deeper branches. By deeper, I mean closer to the trunk. Okay. People of African origin are placed on the deeper branches of the tree.
Closer to the trunk.
Those branches closer to the trunk. And as you go out of Africa, one of the branches from Africa gives way to a branching fork in the tree that we see part of which represented in Europe, part of it represented in Asia, and within the Asian branch we have sub-branches into the Americas. So in actual fact, the movement of humans can also be explained by this tree, where the thinning out of the tree represents that subset of humans who left Africa, probably in the vicinity of between 200 and 2,000 individuals, who eventually gave rise to the gene pool we see outside of Africa.
We have modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, emerging around 200,000 years ago. And then there's a population crash at 70,000, moving out into the rest of the world. It's not surprising that we're all so similar, genetically speaking. We're a very young species.
You know, we normally joke that if you take any two people's DNA and you mix it together, there's about 99.9% similarity. In the same breath, if you take a human's DNA and a worm's DNA, 66% of it would be the same. And we can get even better. You can take a human's DNA and mix it with a daffodil, a plant, and 33% would be the same. So does it make us 1/3 daffodil and 2/3 worm?
How do you see it sort of panning out in the end?
Well, I mean, it brings us back to this kind of exotic place. You know, we can sit on this rock, and you can just imagine 150,000 years, people moving, walking around these other rocks, feeding off the ocean, shellfish, bringing it to the inside, occupying the shelters in terms of the caves we see around us.
Sitting here.
Sitting on this very rock. I mean, it is possible that somebody who has contributed to a genetic lineage, to a living person today, sat on this very rock.
Listening to Himla, the waves, feeling the roughness of the rock, it's almost possible to feel a sense of intimacy with the families who lived here so long ago. It's an intimacy that comes from a story inside us, from our genes. But what of their lives? These present a bigger challenge, but it's a challenge that archaeologists are working on, and we know more each year. We have a better idea of hunter-gatherer life in more recent times.
Hunter-gatherer society varies tremendously around the world. But in a general model, it's women who do most of the gathering, and they, of course, provide most of the food. Men do the hunting, but it's not every animal that's killed that is hunted. If one kills an eland, for example, that's hunting. If you kill a tortoise, that's not regarded as hunting. Hunting is obviously of tremendous symbolic significance. Most hunter-gatherers are mobile, and they move around their territories according to the availability of resources. At times, they might disperse into small family groups, At other times, they might come together in bigger groups where they'll renew old friendships, establish new friendships, and get married. And in this way, they can draw on these kinds of alliances in times of trouble. Clearly, the hunter-gatherers, the San or Bushman hunter-gatherers that appear in the earliest historical records of the Cape were descended in some way from later Stone Age hunter-gatherers in South Africa.
The later Stone Age is a period that begins around 25,000 years ago. It was a time of incredible climatic variation. People had to cope with extreme cold around 18,000 years ago, and then 6,000 years ago, temperatures were some 2 degrees higher than they are today. People abandoned the hot, dry interior and made for better conditions nearer the coast.
Now there is a lesson for us as we face global warming. From about 3,000 years ago, we see people becoming more sedentary. Hunter-gatherers are making wider use of the resources in their territories, and the territories are becoming smaller. In some cases, we see that the territories are becoming more strictly guarded. Access to resources has been restricted to in-groups. Out-groups are being excluded. And then, 2,000 years ago, pottery, sheep, and cattle get added to the mix. But the great challenge for archaeology still in South Africa is to find out how exactly these elements get added to the mix.
When European traders stopped at the Cape in the 16 and 1700s, they encountered Khoi herders who lived in large communities and kept sizable herds of cattle and flocks of sheep. As archaeologists, we want to know when and how that way of life developed. The answer isn't simple. Some archaeologists argue that hunter-gatherers in the far northern parts of southern Africa acquired sheep from herders, and that the practice of casual sheep-keeping then diffused southwards to reach the southern Cape 2,000 years ago.
Then around 1,000 years ago, or perhaps within the last 1,000 years, Khoi-speaking herders arrived, and together with the hunters with sheep, they created the herding culture that the Dutch recorded when they first arrived. Another scenario is more heavily based on linguistic evidence, and this suggests that Khoi-speaking herders, perhaps from East Africa, arrived in the northern reaches of southern Africa, and they spread south into the western half of southern Africa through a sieve of hunter-gatherers, mixing with them culturally, linguistically, marrying with them, so that in South Africa, herders and hunters are genetically and physically indistinguishable. This linguistic scenario also allows for the possibility that the historically recorded Khoi herding practices could have developed in the last 1,000 years or so.
In particular, herders perhaps adopted ideas about cattle from the Iron Age farmers. Cattle were central to their farmers because they got married and established families by exchanging cattle for wives. To learn more about their way of life, I want to take you to the premier Iron Age site in southern Africa, Great Zimbabwe.
This is Great Zimbabwe. It's a special place. It was built between 1300 and 1450, when it was capital of the largest, most powerful kingdom that ever existed in southern Africa. Around 18,000 people lived here, with the king and his retinue on the hilltop above and commoners on the level ground at the base of the hill. The kingdom extended from beyond the Botswana border in the west to the Mozambican border in the east, an area roughly the size of France. And as trade connections reached across the Indian Ocean to Arabia, India, and China. Zimbabwe was a Shona kingdom. Its people were descended from some of the original Iron Age pioneers of southern Africa. To put them in some kind of context, we need to go back in time about 3,000 years to West Africa.
Back then, farmers in the Cameroon-Nigeria region began to spread out into East and Southern Africa in what eventually became one of the most remarkable expansions by people of a single language family anywhere in the world. By the end of it, Bantu languages dominated sub-Saharan Africa. These are languages we're familiar with. Zulu, Sotho, Tsonga, Shona, and Swahili all belong to the Bantu language family.
This is as good as it gets for an archaeologist in southern Africa. It's goosebump stuff. I mean, look at this walling. Such precision stonework. Not a drop of cement. They built a wall that's 11 meters high. They say there are 900,000 stone blocks in this outer wall. And look at the thickness of this wall. It's unbelievable. It's such a privilege to be here.
To see the king up there in his hilltop palace was no small thing.
I'm climbing the ancient pathway to the palace, and its narrowness here provokes an extraordinary sense of anticipation. One can imagine that 600 years ago, people coming to see the king, it might have inspired a sense of awe and fear even. And perhaps they would have approached the palace on their hands and knees, perhaps, looking down, certainly.
What an extraordinary place. It's quite magical.
I'm walking through the palace where the king lived, along with a few wives, his ritual sister, and some guards. You can get a great view of the town from up here and get some sense of what it might have looked like 600 or 700 years ago. Along with the walls, you need to imagine thousands of houses densely packed so that their roofs touched one another. And then in the territory around the capital, people living in ordinary homesteads, farming and producing the food that supported the capital. Farming, of course, is the reason why people expanded out of West Africa in the first place. People were looking for new lands, new pastures, new sources of iron ore. They were cultivating crops like sorghum and the millets, and kept cattle, sheep and goats, as well as chickens and dogs. They were also metallurgists and extracted iron and copper from ore to make tools and jewelry. Later they worked gold, tin, bronze and brass. But iron was always the most important, mainly for hoes for agriculture. And for this reason, archaeologists tend to use the shorthand term, the Iron Age, to refer to this period.
Iron Age farmers first reached South Africa about 1700 years ago and settled throughout the bushveld regions in the northern and eastern parts of the country, where they found good soils, sweetveld grazing, and wood for fuel. Later, about 700 years ago, some farmers moved onto the grasslands of the Highveld, but always they were restricted to areas where good summer rains fell because of their crops. So settlement expanded and contracted according to changes in climate.
Underneath all this magnificence, all this grandeur, beyond the town, farmers lived in simple homesteads, working their fields, minding their cattle, producing food, and generally ensuring that the cycle of life continued. In the end, it was the homestead that survived the rise and fall of kingdoms like Zimbabwe, the rise and fall of chiefdoms, climatic disasters. It lasted for some 2,000 years before colonization turned it into a pale ghost of itself. The homestead was really quite a remarkable institution, and it provided the heartbeat of Iron Age life.